From university days, he'd been nicknamed Miss Balfour, Tiger Lily, or Pretty Fanny. And there were plenty who thought him simply too delicate for the hurly-burly of imperial politics. This was the great age of country house politics. There were a grand total of 2 working-class MPs in the House of Commons, and Arthur Balfour is said to have remarked once that he had no idea what a trade union actually was. Probably a joke, but by then, no longer a very funny one.
At the turn of the century, trade unions weren't a significant political force. Industrial unrest was rare, but in the summer of 1900, events in South Wales were about to change this.
In the second week of August, a signalman by the name of John Ewington, who worked for the Taff Vale Railway Company, was told that he was going to be moved away from his village of Abercynon to a district 16 miles away. Now, he had a sick wife and 10 children, and he didn't want to go. But when he protested, he was told that this was really a punishment for his repeated requests for higher pay. Now, this is one man's story, nothing much, but just sometimes a pebble can begin an avalanche.
The union retaliated by calling an all-out strike. Train services in South Wales came to a standstill. Coal was left in heaps at the pit heads. The strike entered its second week. 16,000 miners were laid off.
Now, the railway's general manager, Ammon Beasley, was a rabid anti-trade unionist, and he brought in blackleg, outside labour, to keep the line running. So, how did the strikers respond? Sabotage. They greased the railway lines so that when the carriages came along, the wheels started to spin and the trains stopped. And at that point, the strikers leapt out from these bushes and uncoupled the carriages. This was extremely irresponsible and dangerous, and it worked brilliantly. Beasley decided that he was going to discuss wages after all, and the strike was called off.
But the battle was far from over. Beasley took the Railway Workers' Union to court, where the judge ruled that the union was accountable for the strike and should pay all damages and costs, £23,000 over £2 million today. Overnight, the unions were crippled. Striking was now financially impossible.
The Taff Vale ruling would transform the trade union movement and British politics. The union leaders began to realise that if they wanted to change the law, if they wanted to protect themselves, they had to get their people inside the aristocrat barnacled club called Parliament. They needed MPs. Didn't happen overnight, but slowly, awkwardly, in ill-fitting suits, sometimes even in cloth caps, former railwaymen, former miners, boilermakers, and lowly clerks would start to win their place in the great Gothic palace of Westminster. Funny the place is, a small local railway can take you.
But for now, the biggest challenge facing Imperial Britain wasn't coming from the socialists, but from the growing industrial competition from Germany and the United States. now Joe Chamberlain, the great imperialist, had found a new magic potion to build a stronger, greater British Empire for the new century. He returned to his old stomping ground to make the speech of his life.
On May the 15th, 1903, Joseph Chamberlain stood on this platform in Birmingham Town Hall and fired the first shot in an extraordinary guerrilla campaign to change the course of British politics. Everything the government thought was important would be swept to one side, he announced, for one issue. It was about the future of the British Empire. It was about where we stood in the world. It was about who would do well and who would go hungry. It had a very boring name, tariff reform, but it would tear this country in two.
Victorian Britain had been built on international free trade. It was almost a national religion. But now, both Germany and America were using import taxes or tariffs as a defensive wall to protect their increasingly mighty markets from British competition.
Chamberlain's response was beautifully simple. We should throw a similar wall around the British Empire. We'd tax all foreign manufactures and food coming from outside, free trade inside. British industry would supply British colonies, the British colonies would feed the British people, and the clincher, the taxes on the foreign stuff would be spent at home on old age pensions. Everybody wins. Brilliant, except for this. Chamberlain's wall of taxes would have meant British industry becoming flabbier, less competitive compared to the Germans and the Americans. At the start of a new century, Britain would have been turning her back, flinching from the rest of the world. And most important, those taxes on foreign goods would make food at home more expensive, particularly harsh on the urban poor. Very soon, Chamberlain's critics were calling his tariffs stomach taxes.
All the members at once in the House of Parliament, on free trade and protection, they were having an argument. Oh, what an argument!
Chamberlain had already torn the Liberal Party apart, and now he was working his dark magic on the Tories. A podgy young Conservative MP called Winston Churchill was so appalled by Chamberlain's protectionist campaign that he crossed the floor of the House of Commons himself and joined the Liberals. Scenting blood, the Liberal Shadow Chancellor, Henry Herbert Asquith, went on the attack. Free trade or fortress empire? The argument raged for 3 whole years on platforms, in Parliament and on music hall stages.
Protect what you require, but let's have free trade among the girls.
Every week, millions followed the twists and turns of Joe's campaign by picking up copies of a recent invention. Newspapers people actually wanted to read. Literacy had been on the rise in England and Wales ever since the Victorian education reforms. The Scots were able to read already, of course. The result was a revolution on Fleet Street. And the man leading the way was one of the new men of the more democratic 20th century. His name was Alfred Harmsworth.